Hello, everybody. Welcome to Tortoise. Welcome to our regular Friday lunchtime Sensemaker Live thinking. My name's Giles Whittell. I'm an editor at Tortoise. And we do this in partnership with Santander, so thanks for their support. In a sense, today's thinking is our half-term special. It's about going back to school. How and when we can do it safely, how we can make up for the lost time that almost everyone who goes to school, or for that matter, university, has suffered, how that can be done fairly for everybody, and whether we should actually just do this whole dreadful year over again. I know I've got at least one colleague at Tortoise who has a very definite answer to that question, which is one of the reasons we posed it. But we've also got some great expert guests we're very lucky to have with us to help us sort through their answers to that question and their take on the alternatives. But I think with the proposed back to school date of March the 8th looming, we also need to talk through what's safe, not just how to make up for lost time, but how to go back to school safely. In a sense, as I was saying to our guests just before we started, these are separate subjects, but they're also linked, and we're already dealing with the trade-offs between safety and education, or safety and lost education. Given that March 8th is coming up pretty soon, we might start there. But first, a brief reminder for those, if there are any, who've not been to a think-in before. This is your chance to hold forth, everybody, not just our guests. You can do so in the chat. Chris has had to dash off, but he might be back shortly. Oh, that's good, that's fine. That's just me looking at the chat, forgive me. But please, everybody else, feel free to dive into the chat. And also, you can raise your electronic hands by clicking on reactions. And then it comes up as an option, raise hand, underneath all those emojis. And actually, I would like to start by inviting everybody to do that. And please raise your hand if you are or are responsible for someone who's at school or at university right now. Let's see how many people raise their hands. In the past, I've been told I haven't given enough time, so I'm going to just count to 5 and see if the number goes up at all. But actually, we have a sampling, but not a massive one. Okay. I'd be really interested to hear from any of you who have personal experience of worrying about your own loss of education, your own safety at school, or those of people for whom you're responsible. So please dive in, everybody. We've got an hour and it goes very fast, especially the last 10 minutes. So don't hold back. But let me come first to Dr. Kathryn Woods-Townsend, who is the LifeLab program manager at Southampton Education School, which is part of the University of Southampton. Now, Kathryn, I'm going to paraphrase something rather than actually quote you, because that's never fair. But in a paper that you co-authored that was published last November and online in December, you argued for investment in systems in schools to make them sort of COVID-proof, including test, trace, and isolate. Object being not just safety, but to get people back to minimize long-term harm from lost education. We're 3 months on from that now. The government is being a bit more careful this time than last year about making rash promises and firm commitments to reopening. But broadly speaking, from where you sit, have lessons been learned, and are we ready?
It's a very, very good question. I think we're all we're all in a position where we're waiting to hear what's going to be announced on Monday. And I think that's not a very comfortable position for anyone to be in, where you're waiting for an announcement before you can really start to understand what's going to happen in a couple of weeks' time, which I think is particularly difficult for all the education leaders in their settings. I think we focus an awful lot on kind of transmission levels and R values and hands, face, space. I don't know how well supported, particularly thinking about schools and colleges where you have a lot of young people in very close quarters together, how much support schools and colleges have in thinking about how they can put in place mitigation systems. So thinking about social distancing and all of those kind of things. Actually, we all want schools and colleges and universities to be open, and we want our young people back in education. And the kind of argument seems to be, we either all want it or it's too dangerous and schools have to stay shut. But actually what the conversation needs to be about is, how do we get schools and colleges and young people back into education safely? And there's not enough focus on what that means. It kind of feels like potentially on Monday it could be a case that on the 8th of March all the doors are open and everyone just goes back all in one go. And I don't know how much planning there has been to support schools and colleges in doing that safely. We have actually been involved in a testing system, which is a weekly testing. It's saliva testing, so it's not lateral flow testing. And the confidence that generates for the school community as a whole has been really immense in helping that school feel safe and open, and help the senior leadership team be able to make really kind of good decisions about which school students need to be sent home if there were positive cases. So I'm a huge advocate for thinking about how we can use testing in an approach to help school, to add to all the other measures that schools are putting in place to keep their communities safe.
Okay, I want to come back and pick up on a point of detail there. Lucy Huberman notes in the chat that, of course, schools are open for children of key workers, and there's a whole separate debate on the extent to which the definition of key workers has expanded since last autumn, and some schools are fuller than others, and some, as I understand it, are more strict than others on their definitions of key workers. But Kath, the project that you mentioned, is that a pilot project at a particular school that you're working with, or is it at your own department within Southampton University? So
it's been a pilot project that was piloted in the autumn term with the University of Southampton and 4 schools within Southampton, and is currently being upscaled to cover more schools across the region.
And it's not lateral flow tests, so you have to wait, what, a day for the results?
Yeah, averagely about 12 hours.
And how in practice does the leadership team use those results?
So what it enables them to do is, if they have a positive case, they're able to write confidently to their parents and say, we've had this positive case in year 8. Of those year 8 students, we know that 94% tested negative. Of the close contacts that have been sent home, we know they all tested, and of those, they all tested negative. Of the staff who have been interacting with those students, we know the percentage of those who have tested. So it just enables the school leadership team to have this kind of robust data to be able to promote confidence in their decisions.
But do they use it as the basis for actual instructions to parents? You may or may not send your child to school, or is it more sort of that they have a sense, they're able to map any outbreak within their own community and issue guidance on the basis of that?
So a little bit of both, actually. I mean, obviously, close contacts, just are sent home for their kind of self-isolation. So it hasn't been used in the way that the government were intending to use lateral flow tests for serial testing. It hasn't been used for that as yet. So it's more about, it's just more about being confident in knowing where the virus is and how it's spreading in the school community.
Right, right. Okay. Well, look, you've raised a really interesting question to which I absolutely don't know the answer, which is how much systematic planning has gone into a reopening or full opening, and guidance shared between government and heads. And so we've got two head teachers with us. Let's go straight to them. First of all, to Rachael Warwick, who's head of Didcot Girls' School, and I think also simultaneously of the Ridgeway Educational Trust, and a former president of the Association of School and College Leaders. Rachael, in your capacity as a head, can you address the point that Kathryn just made? What sort of guidance have you received, and to what extent is it up to you, the basis upon which you open or reopen fully?
Hi everyone. I'm actually the executive head of the trust, which has got 2 secondary schools and a primary school. So I work with the heads of each of the schools really closely. And we have huge amounts of guidance from the DFE, comes in kind of 2 emails a day, including Christmas Day and Boxing Day. So we're not short of guidance. I think though, this is a really key moment, and in my role working with the Association of School and College Leaders, we've been meeting this morning to put our press statement together, which I think is going to be a joint union response, which says basically we're absolutely committed to bringing children back to the classroom as soon as possible. We need to follow the science to be able to do that safely. And we have some questions which just haven't been answered around the efficacy of LFD testing, and some understanding that when you're mass testing in a secondary school of 1,600 students, which is the size of one of our secondaries, it will take us 2 weeks to get through the whole school because they have to be tested twice with 3-day intervals between each test. And if you don't want children to go back into the classroom before they've been tested, and then you've got asymptomatic children potentially in the community transmitting the virus, you have to test them before they come back into school. Hence, we need a phased return to be able to do that over a 2-week period. And that's not us dragging our heels, it's wanting to open schools and keep them open. Because I think the very worst thing now would be to open and then to have to close again, and to have large groups of students having to self-isolate, and teachers. Because what we found in the run up to Christmas, we were struggling to keep the schools open, not because of the numbers of staff who had the virus, but the numbers who were having to self-isolate because they were close contacts, either in school or through the NHS test and trace app. And it was bringing the schools to their knees in terms of the capacity to stay open. So we would like more. It feels worrying to me that this late in the day, we still don't have answers to those questions, and yet we're expecting a clear mandate from government on Monday about what next.
So the questions that remain to be answered about the lateral flow tests, let's try and pin them down. Are they principally about accuracy and the risk of false negatives, or what you were alluding to just then, the logistics of getting a large school tested in time for any deadline? I mean, itemize the questions, if you will.
I think both of those things. I think firstly, the efficacy of LFD tests, because the government has chosen, I think there are various trials, and they had very differing levels of success in terms of accuracy rates, and they chose the study which was most optimistic in terms of accuracy rates. But I think one of them from one of the universities was as low as something like 8% in terms of the accuracy of the tests. They've been dismissed in terms of not being fit for purpose for serial testing in schools. So we've been told not to do that anymore and to revert back to self-isolation. We've been using the LFD tests in our school this term for the students who are in school, the key worker children and vulnerable children and staff. We've not had one positive case, which you could say is a good thing. But then I talked to many colleagues across the country. None of them have had any positive cases. We've not actually had any void tests, which strikes me as very strange. And in fact, the woman who's kind of heading up the programme deliberately spoiled one of the swabs, and it still didn't come back as void. So I just really worry about how accurate these tests are. The second issue around logistics is, if we assume it is worth doing, they are accurate enough to be worth doing, we need to be given the flexibility to manage that according to the different contexts that we work in. You know, the size of our school, how quickly we can get children in and out of them, rather than everybody back in on the 8th of March, which will be really difficult for school and college leaders to manage all in the same way.
Well, from what you say, if the instruction on Monday or the aspiration is a non-staggered whole country return for all age groups on March the 8th, you simply won't have time to do what you've just described.
I think the way it would work is you would have everyone back, but you'd have young people in classes mixing with no social distancing with lots of other young people in their bubble. Our bubbles are about 300 because we have large year groups of 300. And therefore, until they get tested, if they're asymptomatic, they're in the school community, potentially transmitting the virus to other students and staff. So that's my point really about if it's worth doing, fine, but let us do it properly so that we see the benefits of the testing rather than not doing it properly, where the whole point about identifying asymptomatic cases becomes null and void because they're already out there in the school before you've had a chance to test them. Does that make sense?
Yes, it's complicated, I'll tell you that.
But it's just the way I've explained it.
No. But just one more question before we go on to Sammy Wright. Does your anxiety extend to worry that we're going to have another screw up, to use the technical term, similar to the start of this term, when a decision to reopen schools was reversed within 24 hours?
I really hope that isn't the case, and it seems as though there is a kind of more realistic view from government about following, following the data, not dates. So I really hope that's what they're doing, and then listening to the scientific advice that they're receiving from SAGE and other groups, because we've been told we'll have 2 weeks notice before wider reopening, which is far more notice than we've had up until now. So that's good news. But what we'd like is something really sensible announced on Monday that we can then spend the next 2 weeks planning for, which is reassuring for all of our children and young people and their families, and also for our staff. So my view is that we should now start to look at vaccinating teachers and educational support staff, rather than the next phase of vaccination being solely by age, because I think those people are in a higher risk situation than, say, somebody in their 50s who's able to work from home and therefore isn't exposing themselves to the same level of risk.
Well, you've raised another crucial point. I think it baffles a lot of people why teaching staff are not regarded as frontline and therefore front of queue for that. And let's come back to that. But first, if we can come to Sammy Wright, who is Vice Principal of the Southmoor Academy in Sunderland, but also Commissioner on Schools and HE on the Social Mobility Commission. Well, let's focus, just before we get on to all those social mobility and lost years and catch-up issues, on how you as a teacher and as a vice principal feel you've been served in terms of guidance, notice given, and the challenge of the next 2 weeks. Are you calm or a little bit anxious?
I think calm would be going a bit far. I think I'd agree very much with what Rachael said, that the logistics are the key thing. And I suppose my general point would be that I feel over the last year there's been a really, really damaging and divisive discourse, which has kind of laid these decisions and teachers' reactions as something that's a decision on the part of schools, or schools won't reopen, or schools won't do this and that. And actually, at the end of the day, there are some really basic logistical things going on here. So, for example, when you talk about social distancing, Rachel's indicated we have exactly the same thing. 300 in a bubble, they're crammed into the corridors, they're in the classrooms. It isn't happening. And equally with the testing, we made exactly the same calculation, 2 weeks to actually test everyone. These are just facts. And I think that what I would ask the government to do is to work with the facts and to allow schools to adjust and explore things in the way that's appropriate to them and their context, without having this sense that, well, I sometimes feel that the angle is, if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. If you say to teachers they can have this latitude, well, they'll push it too far. Well, I think teachers can be trusted, and I think school leaders can be trusted to do what's in the best interest of their children and to understand the particular contexts that they're operating within.
I don't know if your position on the Social Mobility Commission gives you any particular access to or dialogue with government that other educators don't have. But presumably these 2 points, just to take the 2 that you've both mentioned, bubbles being very big and closely packed, testing taking 2 weeks at a minimum, presumably you've communicated that to government, and have you had a satisfactory reply? So,
I mean, in my role, I have been communicating with government about the lost learning issue. I haven't about the testing. It is something that I've fed back in informal channels, but there's been no specific communication. But that isn't necessarily a fault on their part. It's just that my role doesn't extend into that.
Okay, but then through other channels, are you confident that these basic factual logistical issues are being heeded and taken account of?
Ask me on Monday.
Yeah.
I think you know, I honestly don't know. I hope that on Monday we're going to have a very realistic timetable, and it is going to allow a little bit of latitude. The talk of the Big Bang, rather unfortunate metaphor, everyone starting at once this week, I think was unhelpful, because I think it's about that recognition that everyone starting at once would still necessarily involve, you know, being staggered over a couple of days here and there. And I think that language worried me, but I'm still hopeful that come Monday we'll have a realistic timetable.
Okay. Well, just in a second, let's take another look at those slides, and we can do a bit of a shift of focus to how to make up for lost learning. But Sammy, I wanted to ask one other thing. Are you reasonably confident that whatever else happens over the next 2 weeks, the government is going to be able to avoid the type of showdown that it ended up with Greenwich and other councils over this question of whether local authorities and schools should be able to ultimately decide for themselves?
I think that is going to be probably one of the key pressure points. I think the government is very resistant to the idea of schools and academy trusts deciding for themselves, which is obviously ironic given the status of academies as independent bodies.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that the circumstances, the general picture in terms of infection and so on, is so encouraging at the moment that hopefully we won't be in the situation where a showdown like that arises. But I do think that you're right in pinpointing that kind of conflict as probably the key potential for problems.
Okay, thanks. Let's go and have another quick look at those slides if we can.
So, hi everyone. So far, a lot of the conversations looked at what's going to happen on the 8th of March and reopening schools and all of that very, very complex issue. But what we also know is that there's already a lot of damage that's been done so far. And as our co-founder Katie brought up in the chat, you know, how do we make up for the lost learning of lockdown? When we talk about lost learning, we're talking about the fact that children haven't been in normal in-person schooling. They've missed probably, or will have missed, about half a year's worth of sort of quote unquote normal schooling. The IFS did a study, which I'll link in the chat later, that calculated what this might mean for students. And I mean, they're saying it could cost them up to 40K in lifetime earnings, which is about 350 billion when you take into account every single student in the country. So if we don't act, it could have a huge impact. If we go to the next slide, please. So every single student is affected by this, but we know that children aren't affected equally. There's already what we call the attainment gap when it comes to education. So we know that students from disadvantaged economic backgrounds and also special needs students and others are less likely to perform well at school. And that's a gap that's been sort of steadily narrowing over the last decade, but a lot of people feel that this is going to reverse or change because of COVID. So we can see in this chart that private schools are more likely to be equipped with resources. This was particularly true at the start of the pandemic. Private schools were able to adapt much more quickly. So this is, in this graphic, we can see that they were able to host online lessons and produce worksheets and get in touch with the parents and students much more regularly than some state schools. And this is getting better, but resources are really, really tricky in this area. And a study by the Education Endowment Foundation predicts that the attainment gap will grow anywhere between 11% to 75% over the next year. So it's really a crucial time for the government to act in this sense. Next slide, please. We also know that younger children are more likely to suffer as a result of learning. So this study by Juniper Education Research found that students who are sort of working at or above their expectations have reduced in the time between summer and autumn 2020, as we can see quite dramatically in years 1 to 5. And then in year 6, they tend to do a bit better. This is because it's understood that older children, sort of, if they lose a lot of learning, they might be a bit rusty, but they might be able to make more rapid progress than normal if they do have catch-up in place, whereas younger children might not be able to do that. This study just looks at primary schools. We know that it's also different for secondary schools. So year 7 students in particular tend to be quite vulnerable because they've got this sort of big jump in the kind of materials that they're learning. Can be more difficult, so it can be difficult for them too. If we go to the next slide. So that leads us to the slightly provocative question of this event. Should we just all take another year? The idea behind this, which has been suggested by the Education Policy Institute, is that it will put everyone on a level playing ground and give children the chance to catch up. But actually, what they were saying is that this only should be for students who are really struggling. So again, disadvantaged students or students with special needs and so on. If we did this for every single person, perhaps it might not be practical. It's estimated to cost £6,000 per student per year. And also there's other questions around, you know, when it gets to university applications, there's going to be a year where there's a huge bottleneck because there's lots of students in the same age group and so on. So those are all things that we need to think about. But it could definitely benefit a select number of students. And the next slide, please. So what are the other solutions to catch up? So the UK government has proposed at least 1.4 billion in funding for catch-up programmes. That's about 1.3 billion in England, 127 million in Scotland, and several thousands in Northern Ireland and Wales, not Northern Ireland, sorry. And where could that money go? So it could go to that extra year idea. It could also go into extending the school year or the school day. It could also go into summer schools, or just increasing in mental health and well-being support for students. These are some of the key ideas that big studies have thrown around. And each one, I mean, I could talk about them all for ages, but the kind of running themes throughout these conversations are, number one, who's going to be paying for this? It's hugely expensive. And number two, who's going to be teaching these students for all of this extra time? Because teachers are already burnt out. How are we going to extend their hours and take away their summers? We need to take that into account as well. That's it from me.
Thank you very much, Patricia. And I want to come back to Rachael and Sammy shortly to ask what they think the best way to catch up, to make up for lost time is. But first, even though we'll bear in mind the evidence on one of those slides that this problem might be most acute for the youngest, I want to come to William Jeremy, because even if you don't have your hand still up now, I think you did have it up, and you have experience with A-level tutees, and one-to-one tuition is one of the options that the government is actively considering and earmarking money for. Tell us about your experience there.
Hi, Giles. Hi, assembled company and all. My experience, I tutor history and politics and the English set texts and a little bit of media as well. I have had feedback from the several students that I'm involved with currently who go to very different schools. One is a high school literally up the road in Sevenoaks, and another is at Wellington School down in Somerset. He happens to be a Russian national, to add to the Dr. Zhivago-like story, and he's in Moscow, so he's desperate to get back. Now, Wellington has provided a lot of backup and a lot of very serious online support, etc. And high school up the road, it's been variable, but both pupils and some other ones I've had as well have been concerned particularly about just the sheer amount of work that has been thrust upon them, but also what decisions the adults are going to be taking about the nature of exams, the nature of these, well, the fact that they won't be called, you know, exams, but tests, and how that will pan out. But also, I wanted to posit the idea that maybe the narrative that we are if you like, recycling of the impossibility or the very hard road of catch-up is not too dispiriting, in the sense that people can catch up, but it's in the nature of what sort of catch-up that might be. It could be, instead of a Shakespeare set text, the catch-up could be when the theatres reopen, for instance, going to a National Theatre production, you know,
okay.
I mean, down the road, but the sense that they don't necessarily have to do everything by the summer, and the pressure that is a different sort of pressure to an exam in an exam hall, but nonetheless the worry about tests. Might we can reconstruct a system, take the crisis as a way, I mean, I know this is a big question, a way of reconstructing things. I posit those ideas to the experts. And
well, thank you very much, Jeremy. Let's go straight back to Rachael now to ask, in broad terms, how urgent, how acute do you think the problem is of lost learning? We've all read reports in which it's been sort of quantified and put in terms of lost earnings over lifetimes. How serious do you think it is, and what do you think is the best approach to dealing with it?
To be honest, I don't think anybody really knows yet. I think we have to be careful not to catastrophize this generation of young people, because it's not in their benefit to do that. I think that young people will have been disproportionately disadvantaged by what's happened, and a one-size-fits-all solution wouldn't be sensible, even if it were logistically practical, which it isn't for every, in my view, for every young person to repeat a school year. But absolutely, you know, for particular individuals who are motivated to do that, then yes, you know, we should be thinking about all sorts of out-of-the-box solutions to the situation that this generation of young people find themselves in. It's not a quick fix, so I don't think that, you know, headline catching things around extending school day or shortening holidays would make the significant difference that we're looking for. I think schools should be given a suite of options that they can choose from and be trusted to use the interventions and additional support for academic, social, emotional development that are going to work best for their young people. And I think we need to put more money behind that, because the 300 million that's been promised next year for the catch-up premium, I think equates to around £37 per pupil in England, which is nothing. So it might sound like big money, but it isn't when you look at it across the system. And I think that...
just ask about that number. I'm sorry. That is a part of a headline figure that's been given as 1.5 billion. Am I right? That
was this year. So that's the money that's gone into schools this year. Some of it went to the National Tutoring Programme and 650 million went straight to schools. The money promised for next year at the moment, my understanding is it's around 300 million, which would be £37 per pupil. So it's not quite the figure, you know, that perhaps people assume it is in terms of capacity to make a difference.
That's minimal. I mean, that presupposes that the problem disappears more or less next year.
Yeah, and I think we've got to look at this as a long-term kind of solution. And I'm interested in small group tuition. You know, the Education Endowment Fund research is positive about that. And although the research is not based on a pandemic, there's actually some pretty negative correlation about the advantage of staying behind and repeating a year. So I think that we just need to be careful about that it's not seen as some kind of panacea. And I think that we knew that particularly disadvantaged young people weren't making good enough progress well before the pandemic. You know, progress had stalled. There are some issues which are endemic within our system, which we need to look at. And I hope that we'll take this moment of huge kind of disruption to the system to think differently about what the future might be, to rethink whether we need a cliff edge of GCSE exams at 16 when the raising participation age means that all young people are in education to 18. I think that cliff edge disproportionately disadvantages already disadvantaged students, and there's no need for it. And we should just look differently at how we structure the system, the curriculum, and when we assess young people and why we assess them. So sorry, that's not a very straightforward answer to your question, Giles. I don't know.
No, but it's a pretty clear answer to William's point, which is that you have Rachel's support for the idea that A, let's not catastrophize this cohort and what they're going through. B, let's make a virtue of it, take advantage of it to rethink everything. Rachael, just before we come back to Sammy, do you trust the government to trust teachers?
No, because I don't think there's any evidence of them having trusted the profession for quite some time now.
But they did have this very chastening moment last year when their own exam, I'm going to use a technical term just because I've seen Sammy quoted as using it in The Guardian, when the exam shit show forced a couple of U-turns and ultimately it was teachers' judgments that were taken as the most trustworthy for A level and GCSE student attainment. No sign of them having learnt from that?
No, I mean, that was a reactive decision, wasn't it, to get out of political hotspot. And it looks to me as though they're going to try and do the same thing this year by distancing themselves from anything that looks like an algorithm, which might put a limit on individual students' achievement, but then handing over the responsibility and the accountability to schools, who will be left in a very, very difficult position. How are teachers supposed to really make an assessment about young people's achievement when they've missed variable amounts of learning? You don't understand exactly how well they've understood the learning they have accessed remotely. And we're not even allowed to apparently judge on potential this year. It's on what they have learned so far. And that's so different for different students. There are huge issues there. And I just worry the government is going to skate over them and leave this problem firmly at teachers' feet and school leaders' feet to sort out in the summer. And that's not fair for young people, because they're the ones that will suffer unless this is managed properly and the adults in this room talk to one another to come up to a solution which is in the benefit of all young people.
Thank you very much. There's a lot going on in the chat and I will try to come back and pick up on some of those in a second. But Sammy, first, if we can come back to you. Do you have a view on which of the various practical approaches to making up for lost time might prove most useful in the end?
Yes. I should say before I answer that, I just want to clarify something about the progress gap that was said earlier. When people have made a lot of business in the last few weeks talking about how the progress gap was closing and then this has put it into reverse. It's important to state that the progress gap was about 11% and it was closing, maybe 0.5% to 1% over the course of 6 or 7 years. And then it started widening again in 2019. And in fact, sorry, that's the attainment gap, it's all technicalness. The progress gap had been widening since 2016. Right? And people talk as if there was this magical period in the 2010s when everything was getting better. It really wasn't. And I think we have to understand that what's happened with the pandemic is it is business as usual. It isn't an exceptional circumstance. What it is something very strange and bizarre, magnifying everything that was already there. And what we then come to in terms of what we need to do looking forward is, yet again, we need to keep the focus on what the actual situation is on the ground. We get these stats like the £40,000 per student or however many months have been missed and so on, and they completely miss the point because they're averages. The point about this is it is all about the differential impact. If you think of the £40,000, the way I would like you to consider that is there are some students for whom there will be no financial impact at all. In fact, some will have benefited from enjoying a little bit more independence in the way that they learn. And then there are some students for whom it represents probably 500,000 lifetime earnings. There's some students who, because of the pandemic, will miss the boat. They will miss the chance to get those qualifications that will lift them out of poverty and lift them into achievement. So that's where we need to think about with the catch-up. Now, the suggestions that we've made as a commission, there are two things that we're focused on, because the situation with under 16 students is far more fluid and far more dependent on what we actually find when they're back in school and how we assess them. But there is a real problem for students who are leaving their institutions, who will be leaving their institutions in the summer and therefore no longer have that support around them who can assess and try and think of how to support them further. So our suggestion is that for post-16 institutions, sixth forms and FE colleges, they should be given an uplift in funding, which we've been arguing for years, because the funding...
So, and that funding goes to FE colleges, or does it follow them wherever they go?
It follows students wherever they go. So if they go to a sixth form or to an FE college, at the moment, there's a significant difference between what a student gets funded pre-16 and post-16. But if we equalize that, increase the funding, then the nature of post-16 education is that within the week, students always have slack time. We used to know them as free periods or non-contact time and so on. So it's actually perfectly possible without any adjustment, simply by giving more money to the institutions to fund teachers, to simply up the hours of students post-16. And if you up the hours proportionally according to whatever course they're on, then you can use that time as catch-up time. For students going on to HE, then we have the capacity within universities of foundation years. Again, it's already existing. And universities could be funded to give bursaries for heavily COVID impacted students so that they could do a foundation year before they start their degree. Now, all of that would enable us to target it really specifically at the people who don't have the support of the schools around them. And it is eminently practical and doable. We could do it just like that. The deeper question of catch-up pre-16 is very, very complicated, because there is a difference even between subjects in what we mean. So say, for example, English literature is something that I teach. A student might have missed a particular text. That doesn't mean they need to study that text again. What they've missed is the experience of studying it and the skills that they might get out of it. So we could do something completely different in order to catch up and move forward. Whereas a student doing maths, if they've missed a particular element of trigonometry that's then going to be essential as they go forward, they have to do that particular thing again. So again, we come back to the point that schools need the flexibility to adjust around what they might do with their students. And what they might also find is that maths, for example, in our remote learning provision has been really successful, because there are a lot of very good online platforms that actually students use very successfully, such as My Maths, Hegarty Maths, all these other things. So it's very, very nuanced. And I know from my conversations with the DFE that there is a resistance to the idea one would just give money to institutions and say, you spend it as you see fit. I know there's that resistance, and I think that is deeply, deeply wrong. And it's a classic example of seeking to find accountability and in the process taking away responsibility. Schools are responsible for the education of the young people in them. They are held accountable in all sorts of measures, and we can trust that if we fund them, they will find the way to support their students best.
That's really fascinating. And it feels like the clock is ticking. Can I just this is a question I wanted to put to both Rachael and Sammy, actually. How do you assess which of your students do need the most help? Is that something for which you're planning?
Yes, I mean, shortly, yes. We're planning to test students in low stakes testing, over the next few weeks, just to see where they are at the moment, and we're gathering data as we go. But to be honest, I think one of the things that's very, very difficult is that I think it is underestimated how much teaching is a process of confidence and relationship building. And I think the thing that is really, really difficult is that the greatest damage that students have experienced in this time is all based on those who've lost contact. So those who have not been in contact with school, those who've not been able to have that sense of to and fro with trusted adults, and perhaps whose home circumstances have been very challenging. So I think that there is a very, very emotional aspect to the identification of who's struggled. And I would also say with that, because it was on one of the slides about the idea of putting money into mental health, I am cautious about that, because I'm cautious about the pathologizing of very real and very concrete experiences into generalized mental health difficulties. I think that what students need is they need people, they need relationships, they need fun, they need time, all right? And those things, it's not the same as giving them a counselor.
And do you worry, apart from anything else there, that resources would be diverted to places away from outlets where you get better value for money, to put it bluntly?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing that's very difficult with all of this is that we're constantly trying to assess education on the basis of numbers, like the ones you've shown on the slides. But education, it is a numbers game. Students do need the qualifications to get to the next level. But if the last 2 years have shown us anything, it's that those qualifications are in a very odd sense. They're kind of illusory, aren't they? We're given these grades, we're plucking them out of the air. You are an A student, you are a B student. And, I think we maybe need to use this time to recognize that that there are nuances to support and catch up that are not possible to be assessed in this kind of grand way.
Right. Okay. I noticed Peter Callery is saying in the chat that the focus hitherto so far this hour has been on secondary education. What are the implications for primary education? And certainly one of Patricia's slides indicated that those implications might be very profound. Now, Sammy and Rachael, I know that your primary responsibilities are for secondary kids, but would either of you like to come in on that, or indeed Kath, or indeed if Chris Cook, our own, is back in the room, do jump in. Rachael, from your sort of supervisory position, if you were asked, where is this lost learning emergency most acute in terms of age groups, what would your answer be?
I just don't think I would put myself up as an expert on that particular question until we've had children back in school. And I suppose that goes back to the point about keeping schools open once they're open, because this low stakes assessment that Sammy was talking about, we need to have opportunities to do that, to kind of work out where we think the gaps are in some of the key knowledge and concepts that we think young people do need to move on to their next stages. So I'm more in favour of progression. I think young people want their next steps, their progression routes. So if, like Sammy's idea of moving year 11 into wherever they go, sixth form FE, and then we can look at the key knowledge they need for the course they're doing next, identify where those gaps are and put some more support in, which is really targeted and bespoke, that seems to me quite a positive way, kind of moving things forward, which we could do if there were funding to support that type of approach, because we talk about assessment and exams, and they have become, you know, this huge kind of factor in society. They are illusory, aren't they? What we need is that if somebody's going to do A-levels in science, they've got the key knowledge from their GCSE, which will help them to progress to that next stage of their learning. So if we could think about knowledge and what that means and what it looks like, and the things that we can afford to cut. I'm thinking of next year's year 11 and year 13. I think there should be mitigation for them, for example. There's huge content in the new GCSEs. We can pull some of it back as long as teachers who are experts in this area can look at the curriculum and say, these are the key threshold concepts that you need in this subject. So we have to keep them in, and this is where we keep them in the curriculum or the specification. And then we have more time to do less and do it better. And I think that in turn helps young people and keeps their anxiety at bay, because they feel the challenge ahead of them is manageable, and we're teaching them the stuff that we think is really important and that they do need to know. And I know I've completely kind of bulked the question about primary. I'm not an expert there. What I would say is that we do know that the gap between disadvantaged children and their peers opens up remarkably early in terms of the huge number of words that children will come to school with, and how that is very, very different from disadvantaged peers. So the more we can do in terms of literacy and oracy and reading for pleasure as early as possible seems to me to make huge sense. And we've got to, again, put the funding in place for high quality people working in those early years settings, and not assume that unqualified people are going to be able to make the biggest difference when we need to make it, which is right at the beginning of the child's journey through school.
Thank you. More time to do less and to do it better. Sounds like quite a lot of chats we have at Tortoise, actually. But thank you. It's noted in my rudimentary shorthand. Chris, I can see that in principle, you've got your mic on, your camera on there, and your hat on.
I'm hiding my hair.
You are the person whose name I took in vain at the top, who I understand took issue with the whole idea of a grand gesture of the kind of doing a year over again. Can you address the age group question that I was just discussing with Rachael? For whom is it most urgent? And then take a step back and give us your sort of from low Earth orbit advice to the government on dealing with lost learning. Okay,
so I think I can do it easier if I do it in reverse, right?
Okay.
So I think I agree with everyone I've heard, but in between dealing with builders who unexpectedly turned up at my house, I think you have to think of the problem. There are lots of problems caused by the school closures, right, and the pandemic over the last year. And I use the word closure, which I know makes people cavil, but you know what I mean. You know what I mean. We all know teachers have been working very hard in this new world in which they are both food delivery centres, testing centres, and online learning hubs, and in-person learning hubs for some people too. But I think there are a few problems caused by where we are today that I would focus on. One is around progression. So we have a problem in being able to credential people for the next part of their journey, right? We have a second problem, which is about knowledge, which is what Rachael was just talking about. So there are people who we want, if you want to study chemistry at university and you don't know enough about chemistry, that is a problem that we have to solve somehow. We also have a problem with sort of socialization, with mental health. These are things that sort of run together. And to Sammy's point, I think it's wrong. I think it shades into mental health, but there's a bigger problem potentially, particularly with littler children, about the fact they've been, stuck away from their friends for months and months and months. And actually, a lot of what school is doing particularly when you're a little person, is teaching you how to get along with other people. And these are all really serious, difficult problems. In a sense, they're about, if you can think of them being as quite different issues with around age, right? So the if you can fix the progression problem and you can get people to a destination that is good enough, right, then we can fix the knowledge problem. As Rachael says, if you can get a kid who's 16 into the sixth form college or FE college, or you get an 18-year-old into a university, we then have a process by which we can fix their lack of knowledge, right? We just have to do well enough at bodging the progression this year, and we need to not have people drop through the cracks this year. And that is a challenge when you don't have exams, because obviously most of our progression processes work around exams. If we can get people into destinations rather than worrying about exams for this year, we can then probably deal with the knowledge stuff at the next phase of education if we fund it properly. I think the socialization stuff is the bigger and more scary problem going forwards. So there's also the stuff that we don't really talk about that schools do quietly that no one really addresses. There's a lot of child protection work that's done tacitly by schools around just making sure that kids turn up every day, seeing what condition the kids are in. None of us really know what we're going to find when schools come back properly, right? And I think we don't know what happens to families, chaotic families, when they're left unsupervised in this way for a long period. And I think I've heard lots of stories about young teenage girls, particularly with anorexia. That's a thing that's come up because it's visible on camera. So they switch off camera, they don't get seen really for a few weeks at a time, then they come back on and the teacher realizes there's a really serious problem there. We don't know what we're going to find when things get opened up again. And I think we're going to have to worry a bit more about that end of stuff, potentially the other. I should say I'm a massive skeptic about how catastrophic it's all going to be. I think young people are more resilient than we give them credit for, but also so to take Luke Sibieta, the IFS researcher who came out with that 40,000 number is brilliant, but I think the difference between if you're a 16-year-old who's lost a bit of, say, maths knowledge, it takes quite a lot for that math knowledge to turn into a wages loss and an opportunity loss. If the whole of the rest of your cohort has also had that loss. So things are probably not going to be as bad if you've got weaker knowledge than they would be if you have weaker knowledge in a normal year. And one of the problems with a lot of this analysis is it assumes the rest of the world has continued to have a normal time. Fundamentally, if you're a kid who's got weak GCSEs this year or weak knowledge, say 16 or 18 this year, you're probably going to be in a better position than a kid with similarly weak knowledge or qualifications in a normal year, because we all sort of understand what's going on. It's not like there's a big pool of 16-year-olds who've had a completely normal year alongside them. So maybe we should just be a bit more relaxed about trying to get the median kid up to where the median 16-year-old is normally. I would worry more about whether the rich-poor gap is that's where I'd be focusing. I'd be worried more about the fact that the poor kids have fallen further behind than I would about the fact that the median 16-year-old is not where the median 16-year-old normally is.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm not going to take you back to the early years question because we've run out of time, and I'm going to go a minute and a half over because I want to come back to Kath to where we began. What about the next pandemic? Do we need, while we're doing everything else, to have a revolution in educational tech infrastructure so that there's a much more level playing field next time around when we all have to learn from home again?
Yeah, I think this is a real opportunity, and it's been so fascinating listening to Rachael and Sammy in particular, just thinking about how could we be reimagining what our education system is looking like, and what is it we want young people to be leaving school with at the end of it, and alongside that, what does this mean for education, and how exactly that with the next pandemic, how are we going to be better prepared to support young people through that? We don't have any answers though.
I'm going to ask you to pick up on one other thing. Much earlier in the chat, Lucy and another person whose name I'm forgetting, but who is a teacher, were saying on the practical issues to be addressed on Monday for March the 8th. Why not just accept that there's a risk at this point, that it would all be a horrendous rush, and not repeat the mistakes of last year and say, we're all back in the beginning of the summer term? Oh, Tessa's shaking her head. But what do you think about erring on the side of caution, Kath?
I think we absolutely, when we reopen schools fully, we have to not then close them again. Exactly as Rachael was saying, you know, that is more disruptive for students to be coming back, then having to self-isolate, dribs and drabs, and by the end of a term, actually, you know, almost the whole school's closed. I think that's more damaging for young people than just having remote learning more widespread. You know, I think, you know, the phased approach and thinking about rotas and how we keep schools open in a safe way and having social distancing and masks, you know, that's where we should be thinking about, you know, how we can keep schools more open.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for taking part, especially you, Kath, Sammy, and Rachael. I cannot even begin to think of the anxieties and the late nights that you're coping with at the moment to try and get back to some sort of normal. I take away a number of sort of kernels, all of which could be the subject of future thinkings. One is to not catastrophize what we're going through for the benefit chiefly of the kids, the students themselves. And another, which is we've discussed in other thinkings, is let's not pathologize where it's not appropriate mental health issues. And I take your point, Sammy, and Rachael. I think everybody has chimed in with agreement in the chat saying, please allow schools and teachers to trust them to make the best decisions for their kids. And the answer to the overall question, should we restart the whole year? Well, Rachael made the point that in certain circumstances that might be right for individual students, but I think there's a pretty strong consensus that the answer is no, let's not take a Stalinist approach and force it on everybody. Let us, to use Rachel's formulation, encourage the government to give schools a suite of options and trust them to adopt the best mixture for their particular communities. We could go on, but we can't. It's 4 minutes past. Thank you very much. Do join us for the next Sensemaker Live and indeed the next Thinking, which will be on Monday evening. In the meantime, have a great weekend. The crocuses are beginning to emerge. Bye, everyone.